has 10 other bills to debate today, including additional economic sanctions against Iran and Syria. Last votes are expected about 5 p.m. Eastern. Over in the Senate, another day of consideration of the cybersecurity bill that deals with regulation of Internet traffic. Follow live Senate coverage on C-SPAN 2. And now to the House here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered today by our guest chaplain, Reverend Michael Catt, Sherwood Baptist Church, Albany, Georgia.
Lord God, I give thanks to live in a free land, blessed by you. Since the days of the pilgrims who sought freedom from religious and political tyranny, you have blessed this land. You have guided us through wars and recession and prosperity. We owe our existence to your sovereign hand. May these elected to represent the people follow the teachings of your word. We pray for all in authority that we may live in peace. Please guide the Congress, regardless of political persuasion, to follow the words of Micah 6. He has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before your God? The voice of the Lord will call to the city. It is sound wisdom to fear your name. In the name of my Lord Jesus, I pray. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by a gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Schuler, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize today's guest chaplain, Dr. Michael Catt. Dr. Catt is the senior pastor at Sherwood Baptist Church in Albany, Georgia. I am honored to welcome Dr. Catt, his wife Terry, his daughter Haley, to the U.S. House of Representatives today. Dr. Catt has served as senior pastor at Sherwood Baptist Church since 1989. The church has 3,000 members and has averaged 100 baptisms each year. Thousands have joined the church from Albany and 29 surrounding communities. The church has evolved from a neighborhood church to a regional, multi-ethnic congregation with members from 11 nations. Most notable, under Dr. Catt's leadership, Sherwood Baptist developed an out-of-the-box church outreach. Dr. Catt's goal is to change the world from Albany, Georgia. While this may sound and seem a little radical or even ridiculous, statements from the pastor from Southwest Georgia. It has, in fact, become a reality through Sherwood Pictures. Dr. Catt has served as executive producer of Flywheel, Facing the Giants, Fireproof, and Courageous. Each of these major motion pictures serves to influence the world for Christ. I am honored to call Dr. Catt a friend, and I look forward to how God continues to use Dr. Catt in the future. I ask my colleagues to welcome Dr. Catt and his family as he leads us today's opening prayer. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will entertain 15 further requests for 1 minute from both sides of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, the last thing you want to do is to raise taxes in the middle of a recession, because that would take more demand out of the economy and put business in a further hole. That's what the President said in 2009. But that was then and this is now. If Congress doesn't act, Americans will face higher taxes when the clock strikes midnight on December 31st of this year. The President's solution is to raise taxes on some. That would eliminate 700,000 jobs in our country. 60,000 of those would be lost in my home state of Texas. The tax increase will cost the average American a year's worth of groceries, $4,000. Madam Speaker, almost half of Americans pay no federal income tax at all. What we need are more taxpayers, not more taxes. We need to renew the so-called Kennedy-Reagan-Bush tax cuts. No tax increases on Americans, because the power to tax is the power to destroy, and the last thing we should do is raise taxes in a recession. And that's just the way it is.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition? And the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Don't forget the little people. That's what a gentleman said as he grabbed my hand and looked into my eyes at the Sanborn Farm Museum French toast breakfast on Saturday morning. Don't forget the little people. Who are these little people? I'll tell you right now, these are millions of moms and dads sitting at their dinner table tonight trying to cover their worried expression from their kids as they look over their family finances, wondering whether Congress is going to step up to the plate and give them the tax break they so desperately deserve. You know, only in Washington will people tell you need to address our growing, out-of-control deficit by spending $1 trillion on tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. And not just that. That puts us into further debt with the Chinese. I got a problem with that. It seems simple to me. If we want to cut our deficit, we cut spending. We also ask those who've benefited from tax breaks for the last decade to pay their fair share. Like many of us, I'm with the little people, and I'm with the middle people. Let's vote for a middle-class tax cut today. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? And the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Let the countdown begin. Come January the 1st, the President and Democrats plan to raise taxes on hard-working families and small business. That's right. Instead of reining in their out-of-control spending, the President wants all Americans to hand over even more of their hard-earned money to the federal government. It's not smart to raise taxes ever, and certainly not in a struggling economy. With 3 years of sky-high unemployment across the country, record-breaking deficits, and countless new rules and mandates coming from the White House, the solution is simple. Stop these job-killing tax hikes. It's time to rewrite the tax code, work on pro-growth tax reform, and get this economy working again. Stop the Democrats' massive tax hikes to pay for their big government agenda. The American people want, need, and deserve better. Yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Good afternoon, Madam Speaker. I request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Article 1, Section 8 Clause 7 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the responsibility to establish and ensure operations of the Postal Service. Today, August 1st, 2012, 234 years after the Constitution was ratified, Congress is presiding over the disestablishment of the Postal Service. Today, a manufactured default created by congressional legislation is pushing the Postal Service to the brink. Today, the Postal Service will not make a payment that it should have never had to make in the first place to pay for pre-funding 75 years of retiree health benefits in 10 years, a manufactured default encouraged by banks and other interest groups, a move towards privatization of one of America's most vital services. You know, the Congress has a responsibility to stand up, but here in the USA under Citizens United, everything is up for auction, including the Postal Service. Wake up, America. Universal service is on the line. Wake up, America, and stand up for the Constitution, 575,000 Postal Service workers, and our obligation to the American people to see to it that the Postal Service is rescued from those who want to push it into default or privatize it for their own profit.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to say thank you to Adam Ross and his parents, Dudley and Amanda Ross, from Bowling Springs community in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Adam Ross has been described as a well-mannered, good-spirited, all-around good American boy. When he left Spartanburg to follow in his father and his brother's footsteps to go fight for this country he loves so much, he told his family, Madam Speaker, I know where I'm going, I know why I'm going, and what the purpose is. Madam Speaker, Adam Ross's body was returned to this country he loved and believed in last week in a flag-draped coffin. His parents buried him at the tender age of 19. He died defending the country and fighting for the qualities that make this the last best hope for mankind. So, Madam Speaker, I rise to honor his service, to honor the sacrifice his parents made, to pray for their peace and their wisdom, and to pray that when Adam Ross looks down from heaven and sees the America of years to come, he may believe his sacrifice and service were worth it. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, now is the time for Congress to stand up for middle-class families. I urge my Republican colleagues to abandon their plans to hold middle-class tax cuts hostage to their demands for another tax cut for millionaires and billionaires, and to pass a balanced tax plan such as that contained in H.R. 15 that extends tax cuts for 98% of all Americans and 97% of small businesses. If Congress fails to act, an estimated 400,000 families in Rhode Island could face an average tax increase of $1,600. The Republican tax proposal will end the expanded Earned Income Tax Credit and expanded Child Tax Credit and eliminate the American Opportunity Tax Credit. In my state of Rhode Island, it's estimated that more than 100,000 families would lose an average of $1,000 in 2013 if the Child Tax Credit expansion is allowed to expire. The Republicans' misguided plan would protect tax cuts for the wealthiest while effectively raising taxes on 25 million lower and middle-income Americans. I urge my colleagues to support a balanced plan that protects the middle class, strengthens our small businesses, and strengthens our economy. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday I hosted a field hearing of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, on which I serve as ranking member. This was an opportunity for the committee to hear from local officials on the decision to eliminate Buffalo Niagara from the Urban Area Security Initiative program. Niagara County Sheriff Vortour and Erie County Commissioner of Emergency Services Daniel Nevereth testified that the capability gains under this program cannot be sustained without fully funding this program. The federal investment that supported the security gains achieved over the past 8 years in this program will be lost unless we fully fund this program. Mr. Speaker, the witness testimony made clear that the decision to eliminate Buffalo Niagara from the Urban Area Security Initiative program was ill-advised, short-sighted, and counterproductive. Congress and the Department of Homeland Security must reverse this course and restore Buffalo Niagara eligibility for this all-important program. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition? The gentlelady is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to mark a key milestone in women's access to affordable health care services. Starting today, and thanks to the health care reform law, women will have guaranteed access to a host of preventive services in new health care plans without additional costs. These benefits, including annual well women physicals, birth control coverage, and screenings for domestic violence among them, are a critical step to ensuring that all women get the care they need to stay healthy and treat disease early. Far too often women put off needed care because of the cost. But this new coverage benefit makes some of these tough decisions a thing of the past. Decisions like whether to pay for treatment or to pay for groceries. As we celebrate this day, we must also remember that these health care services continue to be politicized and face many attacks. These attacks are not only divisive, but an intrusion into women's private health decisions. We must stand up to such partisan attacks and support these important health care benefits and thus ensure that all women and their families have access to affordable preventive care services. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
For purposes of addressing the House for 1 minute.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been a hard summer in Colorado, but we have a lot of bright spots, and I want to focus on 3 today, one thing and 2 people. The thing is the patent office. In this country, we've had 1 patent office. It's been here in Washington, D.C., and now we're going to have 3 patent offices across the country, and Colorado got 1 of those. We're going to have a satellite patent office in Colorado, and that will help us continue our innovative and entrepreneurial spirit. Now, the 2 people I'd like to highlight, one is Chief Dan Oates. We had tremendous heroes in this recent tragedy we had in Colorado, but Chief Dan Oates and his leadership of the Aurora Police Department were fantastic, and I want to compliment him on that. Now, the last person I want to highlight, and is a bright spot and will keep getting brighter, is Missy Franklin, who has won a bronze medal and a gold medal in swimming, and she's going to win a lot more. So even though we've had a tough summer, there are a lot of bright things and a lot of bright people in Colorado, and it's going to be better from here on out. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, this Monday, Colton Unified School District held a dedication ceremony for the new Joe Baca Middle School in Bloomington, California. Next week, 800 students from the surrounding communities in Bloomington and Rialto will begin to attend classes there. I am truly humbled to receive this distinguished honor, and I thank the Colton Unified School District. I want to especially recognize Superintendent Jerry Armendariz, all of the school board members of the Colton Unified School District, Ignacio Gomez, whose beautiful artwork will be displayed at the school, and Congressman Gary Miller for his bipartisan support. Growing up the youngest of 15 children in a poor household, I never would imagine that one day I would have a school named in my honor. I never thought I would live to see this day. Again, I want to thank everyone involved, give special thanks to my family for the continued love and support. I yield back to balance my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Then address the House for 1 minute.
And the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, our democracy flourishes when every citizen who wants to votes, but just once. And luckily, there's just not much evidence that anyone's voting more than once. Look at Pennsylvania, where one of the nation's strictest voter ID laws is on trial. The state can offer zero evidence that fraud has been committed. They can offer zero evidence that future fraud is likely. So why would we require voter ID when we know 1 in 10 voters doesn't have ID? Why would we close early voting sites or deny voters an absentee ballot when they can't make it to the polls on Election Day? Madam Speaker, the number of people hurt by barriers to voting is clearly higher than the number of illegal votes these methods purport to stop. So let's quit fooling ourselves and let people vote already. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Oregon seek recognition?
Request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is an important date for women across this great country. Starting today, all new health insurance plans will include coverage for important preventive health care for women. Many have looked forward to this date since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, and I'm thrilled that it's finally here. Because starting today, women across the country will have access to essential preventive health care without co-payments or deductibles. Women who were effectively barred from these services because of the cost will now be able to receive annual visits, testing for diseases like HPV and HIV, breastfeeding support and education, domestic violence counseling, and contraceptives. This is an important step in lowering our country's health care costs and making sure that women have sufficient access to preventive health care. In my home state of Oregon, there are more than 633 women and 47 million across the country who are going to benefit from this change. These are women who had unintended pregnancies because they could not access contraceptives. These are women who avoided going to the doctor because they didn't have the money, only to end up in the emergency room. And these are women whose pregnancies were endangered because of lack of prenatal care. Today this changes. Now all women can take control of their health. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Sequestration. That's the bogeyman Republicans created last year when they refused for the first time in American history to allow a clean debt ceiling vote. So they formed a super committee, which they doomed to failure when they refused to consider a balanced approach that included revenue and spending cuts. And now they decry the impending $1.2 trillion cuts they fashioned and voted for as a crisis for national defense. This gives chutzpah a bad name. If Senators McCain, Graham, and Ayotte want to resolve this crisis in their town hall meetings that they helped create, join me in calling our House Republican leadership to cancel the 5-week August recess and solve this solvable problem. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Vermont seek recognition?
1 minute, revise and extend.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, America needs a farm bill. America needs a farm bill. Our ranchers, our agricultural conservation districts, our dairy farmers, our commodity farmers need and deserve a farm bill. It was passed by the Senate. It was passed by the House Agriculture Committee in a strong bipartisan vote, but for the first time, literally the first time in the history of this country, a farm bill passed by the Agriculture Committee is not being allowed to come to the floor. There's no excuse for that. Is it a hard job? Yes. But is that an excuse for Congress to duck its responsibility? No. Are there contentious issues? Yes. Some on the other side want to cut commodity programs. Give them a shot. Let them bring an amendment. My colleague Rosa DeLauro thinks we ought to restore all funding for nutrition. I agree. Give her a shot. But Congress must do its job. It must bring a farm bill to the floor for a vote so that each and every one of us is held to account to our constituents. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition? The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. 26 years ago, I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I was lucky. I had excellent doctors. They detected the cancer by chance in stage 1. If my cancer had not been caught early, I might not be speaking to you today. Many women are not so lucky because they have never had access to preventive health care. That is why I'm so pleased to see that today, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, more life-saving preventive services will begin to be covered for women all over the country. Last year, 54 million Americans with private health insurance gained access to preventive services without cost sharing, including over 700,000 in my state of Connecticut. Starting today, 47 million American women, including over 600,000 Connecticut women, will now have access to well woman visits, screenings for gestational diabetes, HPV and HIV, contraception and counseling, and support for breastfeeding and for domestic violence. A report in 2009 found that more than half of American women delayed or avoided necessary care because they could not afford it. This is why we passed the Affordable Care Act. Let's help Americans get quality care. Let's save lives.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Minnesota seek recognition? Gentlelady is recognized.
House Democrats and President Obama are fighting for families by working to extend middle-class tax cuts that will benefit 98% of Americans. Our plan will put $2,200 in the pockets of an average family next year. That's money that can be spent by your family on your family's needs. That money will help Minnesota businesses grow and hire employees in St. Paul, Roseville, and Oakdale. But House Republicans refuse to extend tax cuts for the middle class unless millionaires and billionaires get an extra tax cut. That's wrong to borrow $50 billion from China so that millionaires and billionaires can get an extra tax cut of $160,000. The Bush tax cuts for the super wealthy built a mountain of debt and failed to strengthen the economy. The Bush years proved that the Republican love affair with tax cuts for the super wealthy are a wasteful handout. They failed to create jobs. The American economy is strong when the American middle class is strong. I urge my colleagues to vote for the Democratic middle class tax cuts.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today American women win. Congress has finally done something right. No more co-pays for contraception. No more co-pays for mammograms. No more co-pays for well women visits. No more co-pays for diabetes screening, DV counseling, HPV DNA testing, or HIV screening. So what does that mean to women in America? Women in America today are saving money. For contraception alone, $400 to $600 a year. For all women in this country, $1 billion worth of savings because the Affordable Care Act was passed by Congress and signed by the President of the United States. Yes, President Obama does care. And yes, American women win.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Address the House 1 minute or less.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today the House will take up a bill on the Bush tax cuts. The Republicans want to extend the Bush tax cuts to everybody, but tax 25 million Americans by not extending certain credits that they get right now. The Democratic proposal, which I will support and which I'm here for today, despite the fact that my election is tomorrow, will extend tax cuts to everybody and raise taxes somewhat on people who make over $200,000 individual and $250,000 married. Those people will still get a tax cut, but just not as much. 93% of the income growth in the last decade went to the top 1%. That's the people who can afford to pay more taxes. And the fact is, to deal with the deficit, we've got to have both income and cuts to wasteful spending. Republicans and Democrats have agreed. Economists Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz have called on growth, revenue, and cuts. And so have Martin Feldstein, advisor to President Reagan, and Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary of President Bush. So did Simpson Bowles. They've all said you need both revenue and cuts. That's what President Clinton recommended in 1993. The Democrats supported, and we had a surplus wasted on Bush tax cuts. I urge support for middle-class tax cuts, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair lays before the House Communications.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, I hereby announce my resignation effective immediately from the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Should you have any questions, please contact my Chief of Staff. Signed sincerely, Frank Ginta, Member of Congress. The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, I hereby announce my resignation effective immediately from the House Committee on Budget. Should you have any questions, please contact my Chief of Staff. Signed sincerely, Frank Ginta, Member of Congress. The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, I hereby announce my resignation effective immediately from the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Should you have any questions, please contact my Chief of Staff. Signed sincerely, Frank Ginta, Member of Congress.
Without objection, the resignations are accepted. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, by direction of the House Republican Conference, I send to the desk a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 751. Resolved that the following named member be and is hereby elected to the following standing committee of the House of Representatives, Committee on Financial Services, Mr. Ginta.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Madam Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 747 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 155, House Resolution 747. Resolved that upon the adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill H.R. 6169 to provide for expedited consideration of a bill providing for comprehensive tax reform. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. The bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and on any amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except 1 hour of debate on the bill equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Rules. 2 hours of debate on the subject of reforming the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. 3, the amendment in the nature of a substitute printed in Part A of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution, if offered by Representative Slaughter of New York or her designee, which shall be in order without intervention of any point of order, shall be considered as read, and shall be separately debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and 4, one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2. Upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill H.R. 8 to extend certain tax relief provisions enacted in 2001 and 2003 and for other purposes. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. The bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and on any amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion, except 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. 2, the amendment in the nature of a substitute printed in Part B of the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution, if offered by Representative Levin of Michigan or his designee, which shall be in order without intervention of any point of order, shall be considered as read, and shall be debatable for 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and 3, one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3. On any legislative day during the period from August 3, 2012 through September 7, 2012, A. The journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved. B. The chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time within the limits of Clause 4, Section 5, Article 1 of the Constitution, to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. And C. Bills and resolutions introduced during the period addressed by this section shall be numbered, listed in the congressional record, and when printed shall bear the date of introduction, but may be referred by the Speaker at a later time. Section 4. The Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the Chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 3 of this resolution, as though under Clause 8A of Rule 1. Section 5. Each day during the period addressed by Section 3 of this resolution shall not constitute a calendar day for purposes of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution 50 U.S.C. 1546. Section 6. Each day during the period addressed by Section 3 of this resolution shall not constitute a legislative day for purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 13. Section 7. Each day during the period addressed by Section 3 of this resolution shall not constitute a calendar or legislative day for purposes of Clause 7C1 of Rule 22. Section 8. It shall be in order at any time on the legislative day of August 2, 2012, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules as though under Clause 1 of Rule 15. Section 9, the requirement of Clause 6A of Rule 13 for a two-thirds vote to consider a report from the Committee on Rules on the same day it is presented to the House is waived with respect to any resolution reported through the legislative day of August 2, 2012.
Gentleman from South Carolina, recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Slaughter, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
House Resolution 747 provides for a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 8, a bill to extend the current tax rates for all Americans for 1 year, a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 6169, which provides a legislative path for true tax reform, and for other tools allowing the House to finish its business and continue to operate during the August district work period. Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of this rule and the underlying bill. Madam Speaker, why are we here today? My friends on the left will tell you that we are here today to discuss the issue of fairness in our tax code. I would agree. America is the land of opportunity. We believe that the worst possible thing you can do during a fragile recovery that feels like a recession to me is to increase taxes. Why? Because by increasing taxes, we jeopardize another 710,000 jobs, according to the experts. 710,000 jobs. One of those jobs could be held by one of my constituents, a friend of mine named Joe Stringer. Joe Stringer is a middle-class American, 62 years old. His wife, 67 years old, and on Medicare. Joe doesn't make $250,000. Joe doesn't make $200,000, not even $150,000 or $100,000, but Joe does have dividend income. Like 9 million seniors around this nation who have dividend income. And here's the interesting fact, Madam Speaker. When we hear the left talk about taxing the millionaires and the billionaires, here's the new definition. Of those 9 million seniors who have dividend income, 68% of them have an income of less than $100,000. 40% have an income of less than $50,000. But my friends on the left would categorize these folks as a member of the rich with their tax cuts being expired at the end of this year. We are looking at an increase in the dividend tax rate of 185% for millions of Americans who are on fixed incomes. These folks aren't rich. They depend on their dividend income, and yet, with the actions of the left, we would see their dividend income tax responsibility and burden go up by 185%. This is definitely not right. It is definitely wrong. Now, this is on top of all the new taxes that we find as a part of the Affordable Care Act. Another $804 billion of new taxes on Americans throughout this nation. And in addition to that, Madam Speaker, under their proposal, we see the death tax going from 35% with the $5 million elimination to 55%. Now, for farmers, folks in agriculture, for small business owners, Their wealth is not liquid. You would have to sell your land to pay these taxes. It's what we call a fire sale. So my friends on the left would punish people who work all their lives and come up with wealth to pass on to the next generation. But in this instance, the taxes would go up significantly, and that's wrong. In spite of the results of all the surveys, yesterday we had a survey done in my district that said that 61% of folks would like to see the 2001, 2003, and oh, by the way, 85 members of the Democrats voted for these exact same tax cuts to stay in place in 2010. It was good in 2010. It's still good right now. 61% of folks say, let's extend these tax cuts for all Americans, and let's keep that 710,000 Americans who would lose their jobs employed. But in addition to that, the environment that we're working in right now matters. It matters significantly because we have over 41 months, Madam Speaker, of unemployment over 8%. It's devastating. It's devastating, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I hope all of my colleagues will come together here today and realize that the time for political points should be over. That my colleagues would come together today and realize that the time for trying to divide Americans is over. That we would come together today, Madam Speaker, and realize that the time for punishing success is over. And in many ways, Madam Speaker, in many ways, this debate today is about the very soul of who we are as Americans. Are we going to lift everyone up as one nation? Or are we going to push some down to bring everyone somewhere in the fuzzy middle in some misguided attempt to redefine fairness? Are we going to let the foundation of this nation continue to crack, or are we going to strengthen it for another 200 years? I encourage success in this nation. We have to ensure our children can learn about America the same way all of us learned about the land of opportunity. That's fairness that I believe in. Once again, Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this rule and the underlying legislation, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on the rule, yes on the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentlelady from New York.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for yielding me the time, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Madam Speaker, under the rule before us today, we will choose between two starkly different visions for America. My Democratic colleagues and I are proposing a simple and fair tax cut for the middle class. This proposal has already passed the Senate. If passed by the House, the legislation could quickly become law. Our tax cut is based upon a simple premise that it is time for the wealthy and corporations to pay their fair share, no more, their fair share. Unfortunately, despite agreeing with the tax cuts proposed in our bill, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are standing in the way of the tax cut becoming law. Instead of passing a common-sense tax cut, the majority is demanding that any tax cut for the middle class be accompanied by an additional tax cut for the richest 2%. Their proposal is based upon the disproved theory of trickle-down economics, a failed economic theory that has led to record inequality and a broken tax code that is riddled with loopholes and giveaways to the wealthy. For decades, our tax system has been tilted in favor of the wealthy and the big corporations, a rigged system that isn't working for most Americans. As just one example, between 2008 and 2010, 30 profitable Fortune 500 companies paid absolutely nothing in federal taxes. And many more companies and wealthy individuals avoid paying taxes by sheltering the money in bank accounts overseas. This stands in sharp contrast to other moments in American history. In the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, a 30-year period that saw the creation of the middle class and the realization of the American dream, top income tax rates often reached levels we wouldn't even dream of today. But despite these tax rates, we saw incredible economic growth and the creation of the strongest middle class on earth. The middle class grew in part because we did not allow the most successful members of our society to dodge their responsibility as American taxpayers. In years since, we've witnessed a purposeful and concerted effort by some to undermine the notion of shared responsibility which this government was based on. In years since, we've witnessed a purposeful and concerted effort to undermine that, starting with, quote, Reaganomics, end quote, in the 1980s. A new theory pervaded American politics, a belief that our focus should really be on helping corporations and the wealthy in hopes that they might in return help some of us. Many on the other side of the aisle subscribe to this idea and believe that by providing for the powerful interest first, success would trickle down onto the middle class. What we now know is the theory is simply not true. Today, America is increasingly unequal. Millions of jobs have been shipped overseas. The middle class has been gutted. These results are strong evidence that trickle-down economics have completely and utterly failed. In 2001, President Bush proposed a series of unpaid-for tax cuts that exploded our deficit and put millions of dollars directly into the pockets of the richest families in America, and that's where we are today. At the same time, President Bush claimed that these tax cuts would create jobs, and Vice President Cheney told us not to worry about the cost to the nation because, quote, deficits don't matter, end quote. A decade later, we could see that President Bush and Vice President Cheney couldn't have been more wrong. Under President Bush, our deficit exploded to record levels, and according to fact-check organization, he created only 1.1 million jobs. In contrast, President Clinton erased our deficit through the balanced tax plan and created 23 million jobs. Quite a difference. Which brings us back to the legislation that we are considering today. Today, the majority proposes we continue the failed policies by extending the Bush tax cuts for the richest 2%. Doing so, Madam Speaker, would cost us nearly $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And it would force us to continue borrowing billions of dollars from China and force us to make cuts in vital programs like Medicare and student loans. To continue the failed status quo is a disservice to the American people that we represent. It is high time that we started making the tax code fair for those who work hard and play by the rules, not just the wealthy who lobby hard and rewrite the rules. We can do that by passing a simple and fair tax cut for the middle class today. Unlike the proposal from the majority, the Democrat proposal to cut taxes for the middle class is something that both sides already agree on. The majority strategy of holding middle-class tax cuts hostage in exchange for the tax cuts for the top 2% is outrageous, and it must end. Far too often, the majority has pursued a partisan and zero-sum ideology that led this Congress down dead-end roads. We've seen it over and over again, whether it's the majority's proposal to end Medicare as we know it, or inability to avoid a downgrade, the first in our nation's history and in our credit. Unfortunately, their proposal today is yet another partisan piece of legislation that will never become law. Indeed, the President has already said that he will veto the majority's proposal if it ever reaches his desk. When faced with these two starkly different proposals, one, non-controversial and a common-sense tax cut for the middle class, the other, a partisan tax cut to benefit the richest 2%, it's clear what we should do. I urge my colleagues to provide a fair and simple tax cut to all Americans because the rich will benefit too, while standing up for the financial security and prosperity of the middle class. Why would we continue a program we know has failed? I reserve the balance of my time.
The lady reserves her time. The gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to make sure that I note once again, reinforce the fact that this one-year extension that we are suggesting on the right is in fact an extension of not only the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, but also the tax cuts that passed this House in 2010 in a bipartisan fashion. There's no doubt that an action not to extend these tax cuts is actually increasing taxes on many people in this nation. And in fact, if we do extend these tax cuts, what we are actually doing is allowing current tax law to stay in place. But if we don't do that, we are talking about 9 million seniors, 68% of whom make less than $100,000, seeing their dividend income go up in taxation by 185%. That's the middle class. We're talking about the marriage penalty will place a $591 higher tax on over 88 million families. That's the middle class. We're talking about a reduction in the child tax credit that will post a $1,028 tax hike on 31 million families. This looks like to me that my friends on the left are willing to tax the middle class and the poor. I yield, Madam Speaker, to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Trey Gowdy, up to 4 minutes. 4 minutes, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from South Carolina, recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Tim Scott. And I was in rapt attention when he was talking. It was almost as if he stole my thoughts, but I don't mind because he's a member of the freshman class. And many of us in the freshman class, Madam Speaker, we weren't here in December of 2010 when this body last decided to extend the tax cuts for all Americans. Not some of them, but all Americans. 18 months ago. So you can imagine, Madam Speaker, how intrigued we are by the debate on the other side. We're also intrigued at the number of our colleagues who not 18 months ago decided it would be bad economics to raise taxes on any American. Which leads me to wonder, were the rules not fair 18 months ago? I know that's the campaign slogan, that everybody has to play by the rules and everybody should pay their fair share. Were the rules not fair 18 months ago? Was everybody not paying their fair share 18 months ago? Because heavens knows they voted for it 18 months ago, which got me wondering, Madam Speaker, what's different today than it was 18 months ago? Well, maybe the economy's better off. Maybe that's the explanation. And then I saw, well, gas prices are higher and milk prices are higher and bread prices are higher and inflation is higher, which is the most insidious of all taxes, and people's purchasing power is down. So, no, that couldn't be why they changed their minds. It can't be because people are better off, because they're not. So then I thought, Madam Speaker, well, maybe it's because government has become a better steward of the tax dollars that we do give them. Maybe government's spending the money better. And then I thought, well, no, we've had Solyndra, and we've had Abound, and we've had a failed stimulus plan, and we've had a GSA scandal, so no, it couldn't possibly be that we're spending the money wiser. So why in the world, Madam Speaker, would so many of our colleagues who just 18 months ago thought the rules were just fine and that 35% was enough to pay, why in the world would they change their mind in the course of just 18 months? And then it dawned on me, Madam Speaker. It dawned on me while I was listening to the President tell our fellow Americans, you didn't build that, and promising more flexibility in a second term, that we're in the middle of a re-election campaign. It dawned on me, no, the economy's not better, and no, government's not spending its money better, but I have to have something to run on. So I'm going to pit one group of Americans against another group of Americans because God knows I can't run on my record. So let's try the politics of bringing people down and perpetrating this myth that somehow pulling other people down makes me taller. Let's pit one group of Americans against another group. Madam Speaker, the economy is still struggling. Heavens knows it is. People are suffering. If you want economic growth, why in the world are you talking about taking more money from people? Even if you don't think they built it. What has changed in the last 18 months other than the vicissitudes of a political cycle, Madam Speaker? And then I got to thinking, while Congressman Scott was talking, let's assume for the sake of argument, Madam Speaker, that we do what they want us to do. Go ahead and raise it to 39%. It may be 39 this time. How about 50? If you didn't build it, how about take half of it? What about 60%, Madam Speaker? If you didn't build it, take 60% of it. Where does it stop? I know I'm out of time, so I'll say this if I could have 15 more seconds.
I'll extend them 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
What the Democrats want to do, Madam Speaker, is bad citizenship, it is bad economics, it is bad for our fellow Americans. It remains to be seen if it's good electioneering or not. That remains to be seen. But duplicity is duplicity no matter what the calendar says. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlelady from Connecticut for 2 minutes.
I would just like to remind the previous speaker that 18 months ago, it was the Republican majority in this House that made a determination to bring this nation to its knees and to shut down the government because they would not raise a debt ceiling and were holding the government hostage and the nation hostage. And quite frankly, that's what they're doing again today. And this time, it is about tax relief for working families and for middle-class families. The duplicity is on the other side of the aisle, which always is trying to bring this body and this country to the precipice. I rise in opposition to the House Majority's tax plan. What it would do is raise its taxes on 25 million middle-class and working families. People with incomes below $250,000, their taxes would go up by $1,000 each. Why? In order to give another tax break to the rich. The New York Times article said just a few days ago, the Republicans will press to extend tax cuts for affluent families scheduled to expire on January 1st. But the same Republican tax plan would allow a series of tax cuts for the working poor and for the middle class to end next year. Washington Post said, and I quote, Republicans want to raise taxes on the poor. Why? Why, indeed, in order to pay for an over $160,000 tax break for millionaires. The plan would slash the child tax credit, taking an average of $854 away from nearly 9 million families, pushing 2 million children back into poverty. It weakens the earned income tax credit, which kept 8.3. For the gentlelady yield another minute?
I yield another minute.
I thank you.
Lady is recognized for an additional minute.
It weakens the earned income tax credit, which kept 8.3 million people out of poverty last year. This as poverty rates head toward the highest levels in nearly half a century. We all know there's a better way forward. The Senate has passed a plan supported by the President, which cuts taxes for 98% of Americans, 97% of the small businesses in the country. Rather than holding tax relief for the vast majority of American families and small businesses hostage to more tax cuts for the wealthiest 2%. Let us take up that Senate bill. I urge my colleagues to vote against the rule and this Republican reverse Robin Hood tax plan and support tax relief for the middle class.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to make sure that we remember the facts as they are. There's no reason for us to so quickly revise history to meet our political objectives. In 2010, this House controlled by the Democrats, the Senate controlled by the Democrats, and the White House controlled by the Democrats passed the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts. So what we're talking about is a bipartisan piece of legislation that would continue the current tax law because the previous Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, decided that tax cuts were good for all Americans. And now we find ourselves, as Mr. Gowdy said, in the midst of a political season. Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rich Nugent, the sheriff.
Gentleman from Florida for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank my good friend and fellow Rules Committee member Tim Scott for allowing me to speak on this very important issue. This rule does something that is decades overdue. It puts the nation on a path to comprehensive tax reform. Achieving a fair, simpler tax code isn't an easy goal, which is why we're considering today and tomorrow a multi-step process. First, we need to extend the current tax rate. Extend the current tax rate. This extension gives us a bridge, the time we need to dig into the tax code and find a way to make it work for all Americans, not just some. Perhaps even more importantly, it stops the largest tax hike in history. It's worth repeating, the largest tax hike in history. Madam Speaker, this tax increase would threaten more than 700,000 American jobs, and for those folks lucky enough not to lose their job, it could very well lead to lower wages for them. If we don't act, the Democrats' tax increase will hit 53%, more than half of all American small business income. When we brought the small business rules up at the Rules Committee last night, the way they come back at the questions I asked, they came back with statistics, things that really matter not much to anybody. But when I talked about small businesses in my district, those folks that are going to be impacted by this increase on taxes for those making over $200,000, it relates to actual jobs, what they can create and what they may have to cut back on. These are real people, not some statistics that somebody in some Washington think tank came up with. These are real people, real job creators in America. And we're talking about now stifling that at a time when job growth in America is anemic at best. My fellow speakers earlier talked about just that issue in regards to what's changed. What's changed in America since that increase or the 2001-2003 tax decrease was passed by the democratically controlled Congress in 2010. What's changed? You heard from my good friend Mr. Gowdy, nothing's changed. And now we're going to look at those job creators and let's slap them again. Let's take away the certainty for people in my district that have, we have almost 11% unemployment in my district. So now we're going to crush them again by taxing those job creators and putting jobs out of the reach of real Americans. I thank my friend. Listen, H.R. 8 will prevent real hard-working Americans from getting hit with the history's largest tax increase. We have an obligation to make sure that we can do this. We extend it for a year, and it gives us the opportunity. It's been decades since we've had real tax reform. And we have the opportunity to have, for the Ways and Means through regular order, to have input from both Democrats and Republicans alike, experts in the field, to talk about how we craft tax policies that are going to carry us through the next decade.
Another minute.
This is such an important issue, Madam Speaker. This is about the future of America.